somewhat limited area. With this enormous power, practically undisturbed from the air, day and night they had been taken over the river.
Okay, guys.
The blow aimed at
spaghetti
the
time.
short sector grew to devastating dimensions.
Italians.
I already realized
We need to
that the
defend.
Oder front was lost. The words of Obergruppenführer Steiner rang in my ears. How shall all this end? I asked myself time after time, while with burning throat and wildly thumping heart I ran over the field, towards a small group of armored vehicles standing in a clump of trees. They were some of our own. The company's adjutant was in command. It was he who, together with the driver from another knocked-out half-track, had taken mine and driven here.
Let them come.
The company commander was a new one who had been sent to replace the wounded one. Another had been killed, and there were 2 wounded platoon leaders. The company adjutant, Hudelist, had stayed there to pick up possible late-coming survivors. He told me that 12 men of my platoon had been killed in the village, and that my driver, together with the half-track we had saved from the burning barn, had been sent into the air by a direct hit right before his eyes. Of the mortar platoon's 10 half-tracks, 4 were left, with reduced crews. In that short moment, we had lost more men than during several days' violent fighting in Stettin. Men from the shattered front line now started to emerge from the edge of the forest. We ran towards them and took care of those in worst condition. They were totally exhausted and shocked.
Looks like parachutes.
As many wounded as we possibly could take on our half-tracks were helped to hold
Let's see
on.
what this is.
The most badly wounded were put on the almost horizontal flat
Tutti a
bonnet.
terra!
The others followed running as we drove on to join the main force of the depleted Recce battalion.
Stupid.
At
Light
least
up
it
my
gave
own
them some
position.
feeling of
You
returning
idiot!
strength and
You
courage.
stupid
Following the
assholes.
tracks of the armored vehicles gave them a small sense of security. Having reached the nearest road, we managed to stop some empty ambulances, which took care of
we
the
know where
wounded
they are.
Wehrmacht soldiers, and we could carry on alone. My vehicle was quite badly damaged and needed a thorough overhaul and repair at the nearest repair unit. It was possible to drive, even if it was not up to much. Yet we were able to follow the other vehicles, although we could not maintain the same speed. That is how it came about, that suddenly we were alone,
We got more.
in the middle of a unit from the Wehrmacht, under the command of a Major, with a Knight's Cross and a hard, hot-tempered look. I had noticed him earlier in the morning in the village, where he commanded the motorized unit that, together with us, had had its front-line position there. Obviously, he had now raked together all those able to fight, and those that he had managed to stop among the retreating. He was now fully occupied grouping them for defense in a wide semicircle, out in the middle of the field. The Soviet attack fighters would lick their lips when they caught sight of them, and that probably would not take too long. With his chin in a brutally advanced position and a pistol in his hand, the Major ran around chasing the men. This was murder and suicide. As he saw our half-track come slowly lurching along, he rushed towards us and gave the signal to stop. You could tell from his face that an armored vehicle was just what he considered he needed. The driver stopped the vehicle, and the company's adjutant, Hudelis, who was sitting on the top, while I was standing in the hatch opening, asked calmly, and without any introductory words of politeness, what it was all about. In the Waffen-SS, respect for officers from the Wehrmacht had never been overwhelming, and an Iron Cross First Class in the Waffen-SS was ranked almost as high as a Knight's Cross of an officer of the Wehrmacht. You could see on the Major's face that the nonchalance of the adjutant made him furious. "I guess you're running away!" he roared. "Oh no, we are just going to join our unit," the adjutant answered, still sitting on the half-track. "If you don't come down from that vehicle at once and stand to attention when you speak to me, I'll make a hole in you," the Major growled and waved the pistol. The adjutant and I exchanged a quick glance. You could tell from the Major's look and his angry, bright red face that he meant what he said.
Taking this.
The adjutant jumped down from the vehicle, stood to a stiff attention, saluted, and reported, Major, I am adjutant of the 4th Company, Abteilung, SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, with 2 men and a half-track of the mortar platoon, under transportation to the collection point of the company. I need you here. You will be put in fire support. Await orders from me, I said, and turned around to continue the route. Major, the vehicle in its present condition is useless. It has to be, according to orders, taken to the nearest repair unit for repair. The adjutant dared to object. The Major rushed back towards us. You stay here and await my orders. Then he left. The adjutant climbed up on the half-track again. This was a nice prospect. Everywhere violent sounds of battle could be heard, and the thunder of artillery came closer. And there, in the middle of the field, stood some 100 men without any protection at all. A sweep from a fighter plane, or a well-aimed set of shells, and there would not be very much left of it. The adjutant did not say a word, just glared grimly after the Major, who was rushing away. As the Major reached the furthest flank, about 300 meters away from us, the adjutant leaned down into the half-track and said to the driver, "Drive as fast as this thing can." Growling, the half-track shook away. It was not cowardice. No one has ever yet dared to accuse me of that, and I do not think there has been a reason to do so either. On one hand, we have to join the company before the Bolsheviks turn up everywhere. On the other hand, we do not want to be killed in such an ignominious way without a chance to hit back. The adjutant muttered all this to me as we hung out from the hatch opening and peered in the direction of the Major, who still had not noticed our retreat from his insane defense line. We felt sorry for the men there. We had come perhaps 300 meters away from there when an unpleasant, all too familiar howling was heard. Stalin organs. Instinctively, you pull down your head between your shoulders. Bullseye, right in the middle of the force of men. The salvo from the terrible weapon gave such a total result as only Stalin organs or German Nebelwerfer can attain. We saw black-brown earth and human bodies whirl up through flashing explosions that came one after another. As the black dust settled, not a movement was seen among the soldiers there. The horrible work of an instant. We looked at each other. We were there just a minute before. Once again, luck and the unfathomable instinct that warns the frontline veteran had given us a hand. Beyond the field, we reached a meandering road that we followed. Suddenly, the fighter planes came. Repeatedly, they came down over the road and the fields, where swarmed even closer numbers of vehicles and retreating soldiers. Like a scythe, the hail of bullets whistled over men and vehicles. Each time one such monster came roaring, we threw ourselves into the interior of our half-track. They gave us no peace. It grated on our ears and made our entire bodies ache at the sound of their howling engines. Increasingly, we passed burning vehicles and entire rows of fallen soldiers who had not got far enough away from the road to escape the projectiles. But once again, we were lucky. The assault whistled and crackled around us. We crouched down and tried to think of something else, and at last the attack was over. So it continued innumerable times. In a bend stood Standartenoberjunker Schwark. We picked him up and moved on. After the company commander had been wounded, Schwark, only 20 years old, had been given the command of the 5th Company. He had stayed to try to find us in all the chaos and take us back to the supply unit. About 50 meters from the road, an 88mm gun was standing. Stripped to their waists in the sunny weather, the crew worked frantically. The sweat shone on their backs as they ran forth with the shells, loaded and fired in a steady, fast pace. From the sky, a Soviet fighter plane suddenly came diving like a falcon. The engine noise and the whistling airstream warned the artillerymen, who, without any sign of panic, ran away to their protection trench after having sent off the shell that was already in the barrel. Like an arrow, the plane dived down at the gun placement. The engine noise grew louder with the dizzying speed to a deafening, frightening howl. Just a hair's breadth over the gun, the plane dropped a bomb, turned its nose a few meters over the ground up into the sky, and climbed with fantastic speed and disappeared. The bomb missed its target by about 30 meters, threw up a mushroom-shaped cloud of earth, but did no harm. The artillerymen rushed out of their protection trench, shells were brought out, put in the barrel, and the firing continued mechanically, as fast as after a short break on the exercise field. It had been a short but fascinating intermezzo. What an alarmingly gifted pilot! What a dive! And what hard-boiled, steel-hard fighters were these anti-aircraft gunners who only unwillingly, it seemed, ran away from their position. Immediately after the bomb exploded, they ran back and continued the fast firing as if nothing had happened. Under Schwartz's command, we drove past long caravans of retreating units and gradually reached the supply unit and rejoined the company.
Come here.
Many familiar faces were missing, of men who that very morning had smoked my cigarettes or borrowed my pipe tobacco, with whom for months the fortunes of life had been shared, and who had kept clear heads in many dangerous situations. The gaps were terrifyingly large, and as Standartenoberjunker Schwark ordered us to form ranks, it appeared that about half of the men were gone, most of them killed. Of the wounded, only those with more serious wounds were absent. Everyone who could still walk, stand, and handle a weapon had returned from the nearest first aid station after having been given a meager bandage. Felix Steiner would have had his heart warmed if he could have seen these thinning ranks of smoke-blackened, dirty SS men with torn uniforms, many with bloody bandages, but everyone ready for new engagement. The horrors of the morning had shaken, not broken us. We still had weapons and ammunition. Orderlies hurried here and there. Dispatch riders drove back and forth on highways and on sandy village roads. Meanwhile, rumors flew around. Contradictory information went from mouth to mouth, was answered and denied. For everyone thought it was clear that the general offensive against Berlin had opened.
Soldato!
Certainly, we had not been in the extreme foremost front line and seen them coming. But the violence of the artillery hurricane and the enormous forces of bomber and fighter planes had shown and told us clearly that this was the prelude to the hour of decision. Out on the roads, chaos ruled. Every crossroad, every little railway station, and every bridge was showered with bombs. And over the marching columns, the projectiles rained down from the fighter planes. Tanks, cannons, trucks, ambulances, and tractors were heaved around and mixed in confusion with dead horses and the twisted bodies of fallen soldiers and torn off limbs. More and more often, traffic jams occurred, and on the compact masses, the bombs had a terrible effect. Run away from the road helped only a little, because around them spread only arable land and fields, with only occasional small groups of trees here and there. Bombs did the heavy work, and the fighter planes searched thoroughly. They hunted in wide groups and sharp turns at 30, 20, even 10 meters height after the fleeing soldiers. Out in the field, their projectiles plowed long furrows in the ground. The bursts of gunfire raged among the running men until they fell and remained still. In the middle of this bloody confusion, the staff of the Nordland division was stunned and killed. The scattered battalions and companies were gathered and made ready for action. The front had really come into being, and it did not take long before we got combat contact with the Red Army once again. It was a repetition of the exhausting Battle of Pomerania. Everywhere, the Bolsheviks turned up before we knew anything. There was no limit to their tank forces. The infantry we saw less of, though. It was with material superiority that they would break us now. Time after time it happened that we, involved in combat, realized that the forces we had against us consisted exclusively of tanks, assault guns, and entire battalions of Stalin organs. There was not one infantry soldier. The motorization of the Red Army had reached its peak. The infantry were obviously mostly transported on American trucks, following in the tracks of the tank units. The struggle was furious, and our losses were heavy. Our division soon had not much more strength than a regiment. As orders came that this or that company should go into position to defend a sector of the terrain, it was not unusual to see an Untersturmführer take a machine gun on his shoulder and move off, together with an Unterscharführer and a couple of men who carried the ammo boxes. And that was the whole company. What could we hope to achieve with battalions of 40 to 50 men and regiments with 200 or 300? But we continued fighting. Into position, a short fight, then up again and away. We would be suddenly surprised by fire from behind, find ourselves surrounded, but somehow come out and be back in combat again. So it went on continuously, without sleep and almost no food, for days. Ivan, who always used to avoid assaults at night, now kept on moving uninterruptedly round the clock. It felt weird to hear the tank engine's dull growling continue through the dark, to see the muzzle flashes, and to hear the Bolsheviks' battle cries. Our strength was strung out to an extent that one might almost say was superhuman. But for every position that we were forced to abandon, the enemy paid a high price in their fallen. During those first days after the catastrophe at Kustrin, we never saw soldiers from other units than our own division. It seemed as if the whole burden was on our shoulders, but of course other units close to us fought the same desperate struggle against those superior forces. As we hovered between life and death in those days, we did not have time to think about such things. For a platoon leader, there was not even the possibility of any general view, even within a narrow sector. We fought, ran, drove, dug in, fought, ran and drove on again, all without pause, without ever getting out of the iron grip. It was so exhausting and took our strength so completely that no separate events remained in our minds. It just became a continuation of mixed and confused sights of shell explosions, burning tanks, farms and cities. We saw villages in smoking ruins, or blazing bonfires, dying comrades to the right and to the left, and we heard their mournful groaning and piercing cries of pain. We saw bearded, dirty, bloody soldiers' faces with red-rimmed eyes. I do not know for how long we had been alone against these superior forces in our sector, but at last other units began to come to our aid. Certainly there was no time for proper and much-needed rest, but at least we had time to get our breath now and then between the fights. We could sometimes stretch out for half an hour before waking up to a new engagement. We were sick from the tiredness that lay like lead over body and brain. The tension would sometimes ease, then we might just have a nice short nap. Sometimes we had time to rush into some farm when passing to eat some of the food that perhaps was standing untouched on the table. Sometimes food was still on the stove, hard and cold. Sometimes clothes and household utensils were still in place, as if the owners had left the rooms just for a short while. However, in the cowshed, the cattle were mooing, and on the porch the cat was sitting, licking its paws in the sun. The high speed of the Red offensive in these surroundings had made the escape of the civilians panicky and precipitate. In tragically many cases, the fleeing were caught up and captured or murdered by the Bolsheviks. These swarmed in everywhere behind the defenders, who no longer managed to keep up a continuous line. Among the new incoming troops, there were plenty of Fallschirmjäger, men of the right, tough stuff, who brought with them the responsibilities and memories of Crete, North Africa, and Monte Cassino. They knew their work. In other places close to us, Walloon and French SS volunteers fought with Gallic bravery. The speed of the offensive was slowed down a bit, but we never managed to create an unbroken defense line. Too often, newly built-up defense positions were knocked out by some of the Bolsheviks' strong tank spearheads that succeeded in penetrating deep into a sector. Our own minor reserves, that should have been put into action with a chance of success in some other place, had to be thrown there hastily, with the result that the sector from which the rescue had come was cut off by some other tank assault. In that way, the Russians bored their route towards the west, through surroundings that within a few hours were transformed from fertile peasant country to devastated steppe. More than once we had to withdraw hastily from some resistance nest because the Bolsheviks attacked our rear by coming in on our flanks. In such cases, valuable equipment had to be abandoned. In exceptional cases, it was possible, by retaking the lost terrain, to take back the equipment before the Bolsheviks had destroyed it or taken it out. 8. A gauntlet. I made such an attempt to bring back lost equipment, together with 2 mechanics, in one small town. It had been lost in the early morning, but, later the same day, had been recaptured by our Fallschirmjäger. During the headlong retreat that morning, our Aufklärungsabteilung had to leave an assault gun behind in the ruins. It had some engine problem and could only drive backwards. However, it was standing in such a bad position between a couple of badly damaged houses that it was impossible to get it out as we withdrew. There was no time to repair it, but I thought that it was a shame if an otherwise faultless and ready-for-action vehicle should be lost and fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. So I took 2 mechanics, and in a heavy Steyr car, an excellent and far superior German version of the American Jeep, organized from a Wehrmacht depot, we drove back towards the town. For all emergencies, I brought Walter Leisergang, one of the most reliable men in the platoon, and, of course, a machine gun. We drove straight towards the roar of battle. Obviously, we had to hurry up before Ivan had time to refresh and attack again. It was an unpleasant surprise when we discovered that the worst thunder and crashing came from the target of our expedition. We did not worry too much about the belching of smoke over the town because it had been burning since the previous evening, as the Russian artillery had started playing its preludes. The risk was that the Russians were already back in the town. A few hundred meters from town, we met 2 Fallschirmjäger, who came carelessly trotting along as if on a Sunday outing, with their pipes dangling in their mouths, cartridge belts over their shoulders, and small dust clouds whirling around their marching boots on the sandy little byway. I slowed down and asked what it looked like over there. "Is it Ivan shooting in town?" "No, it's our own tanks firing. No risk so far," they both explained convincingly with one voice, and continued their Sunday-like walk. "Well, let's carry on then, lads," I said, and we drove off. Certainly, it was easy to figure out that the Bolsheviks could not be too many hundred meters beyond the town, but they were not there yet. It was clear, though, that we had to hurry up before they came. Full throttle. With maximum speed, we drove in on the main street, and as fast as possible wove between the shell craters, among blown-up horse carriages and anti-tank guns that Ivan had left during his retreat. There was no lack of fallen Russians. They were lying everywhere like brown-yellow bundles in strange positions. As we went, I could see 3 Fallschirmjäger with a Panzerschreck behind a partly ruined fireproof wall. Even if they did not rub their eyes, they looked surprised, to put it mildly. They waved eagerly and shouted something at us, but we were in a hurry and did not have time to listen. With an elegant turn, we stopped in the town square with flowers at the edge of a small pond. In peaceful, happier days, this was the playground of the town's children, with slide, swing, and sandpit. I guessed that a week or only a few days ago, blonde-haired children played here and filled the air with their joyful laughter. Today, They were probably fleeing on the roads westward, chased by American fighter planes, or lying in ditches with blood in their hair. Today the swings stood empty, reminding us of the Russian invasion. Other sounds filled the air, not soft and playful, hard and shrill. The soft lawn, fresh greenery, and flower beds with blazing spring flowers were badly damaged, and the young trees were broken and splintered by shells. The smoke lay like a poison cloud over the once idyllic, but now pockmarked plantation. There were powerful rumbles here and there in the town. Running, we crossed the square, turned in on a side street, and worked our way up the quite steep hill. Up there on the crest, squeezed in between the houses, stood the assault gun, which we could repair and bring back with us. The long barrel, pointing eastwards, stuck out from the row of houses. No soldiers could be seen, but rumbles and clanking sounds could be heard. Otherwise, the town seemed dead. Just before we reached the crest, we heard the clatter of tanks from the other side. "Move, men! Our tanks are starting to withdraw!" I shouted over my shoulder to the others. Just then, a tank appeared and heaved itself up on the crest in all its splendor. I stopped dead. Hell, am I right? That long barrel, that turret, it was a Stalin tank. There was a click in my head, and my heart jumped into my throat. "Get back! It's Ivan!" I shouted, and started running down the hill, head over heels. Up there, they were not as surprised as we were, because before we had run many meters, the first shell came whistling between the houses. We ran as if on fire, but it became worse. The shells whined and howled between us and above us, and the opening in the street was down there like a distant mirage. Fright gave us wings. As with heads down, we rushed along the cobbled street. At every dull bang from up there, the heart contracted, but their direct shooting did not succeed, and the shells hit somewhere on the other side of the square. Then they started shooting diagonally at the house walls to reach us with splinters. These whistled painfully around our ears and clinked against the pavement. My left sleeve was ripped open by a splinter. One of the mechanics had his hand torn to pieces so that the blood sprayed as he ran in front of me with swinging arms. But we got away. At last, with an extra effort, we threw ourselves around the corner of the square, at the same moment as a window came crashing down. No further order was needed to get the men running at full speed towards our car by the pond. I happened to glance to the left and saw Bolsheviks with submachine guns come walking quite light-heartedly along the house walls from the eastern half of the main street towards the square. Then I began to realize what the Fallschirmjäger behind the fireproof wall shouted at us as we came. "The town is in the hands of Ivan!" Had they seen us over there? In that case, we could say goodbye. As we ran over the lawn, I could see that a brown-yellow figure stood tampering curiously with the machine gun in the car. Before he could react, I got my pistol up and he sank over the gun. Up in the car. Walter threw the Bolshevik aside. He was a small Kyrgyz with flat face and slanted eyes. We jumped down in the back seat with the machine gun over the edge. The mechanic, with hands unhurt, was ready with the submachine gun. At full speed, we rounded the pond and set off towards the way out. The Bolsheviks at the other end of the square came running, but Walter kept them down with the machine gun. A patrol, which sneaked forward in our direction, was so surprised as we slid, jumped and whined past that they did not think of shooting. But Walter and the mechanic did, and the Russians fell like puppets. The pungent smell of smoke disappeared, and the air was blowing freely around us again. We were out of the town, leaving it and the Bolsheviks behind us at increasing speed. Not until then did we feel the exertion. The sweat ran down our backs and hot faces, finding its way into our eyes, smarting with the saltiness and flowing into our mouths. We all panted with the excitement and tension that did not let go until we were back at the supply unit. There, urgent preparations for combat were going on. We would be sent into action again. Our company, which after
Siamo
all had
incastrati.
managed better than most in the division, now numbered not more than 40 men. The indescribably hard days after Kustrin had cost us more good, brave comrades than during many months earlier in the campaign. Now, those times seemed to be over forever, when after a hard engagement we could withdraw behind our lines for a week, or at least a few days, to refresh ourselves and recover before returning with renewed strength. The word rest did not exist for us anymore. There was only engagement, and more engagements, with very fast energy-sapping troop movements in between. After all that had happened, we should by now have been used up, finished, over and out. But we clenched our teeth and forced ourselves on to even greater struggles. We went on automatically, without any time for reflection, but on pure instinct of the sort that helps the frontline soldier to survive, when theoretically he should be dead, either by bombardment, close combat, or ambush. The brain could not take in anything more while in this state of exhaustion. Not until now had we fully shown the meaning of a defiant fighting spirit, or of a burning conviction and knowledge of a clear cause for struggle, all of which are needed by the front-line soldier. Without this, he can certainly fight, especially when he has superior artillery, aircraft, and tanks in support. But in adversity, in the face of an apparently invincible enemy who has countless material assets, and without support from his own side's heavy weapons, he collapses and longs for captivity. 9. A spark of hope. When you are in practically uninterrupted engagements in the foremost front line, without contact with the outer world, and with days and nights melting together into a continuous crescendo of bombardment, close combat, and nerve-wracking experiences, there is no possibility of measuring time. It is as if the wheel of time had stopped, and the present were eternal. It seemed impossible to escape from the present. In our case, it was completely filled with nervous strain, shocks, and frightening sights. Single events in the long chain of fateful days and nights were mixed together into one huge, unreal picture of horror, where even today it is difficult to separate the details. The general impression that remains today from that bloody April 1945 is the feeling of a lonely warrior's desperate final struggle. Almost disarmed and bleeding from countless wounds, we found ourselves up against an enemy of unlimited resources. We were getting closer to the end. The landscape changed character. We drove into the pine forests of Mount Brandenburg, where small lakes glittered between the trees. Weekend cottages, taverns, and small refreshment inns for cyclists and motorists who used to come on Sunday trips became more and more numerous. Now they were empty, or temporarily lodged wounded and exhausted soldiers. On the gable of an idyllic little tavern close to the highway, we met the blazing words, "Berlin bleibt Deutsch." Berlin remains German. They were painted over the bleached wall advertisement of the beer brand Berliner Kindl. When we saw the words for the first time, it gave us a deep feeling of fatefulness. The struggle was drawn to its end. Now or never, the fortunes of war had to turn. If not, everything that after years of deprivation, hardship, and indescribable mental strain we had voluntarily fought for would collapse in chaos. It would be without equal in the history of mankind. Berlin bleibt Deutsch. What a road was behind us, as now we stood facing this last, defiant, fighting talk. Once we had stormed forth victoriously over the boundless plains of East Europe. With the fighting excitement of youth, we had thrown ourselves into battles that have gone down in history. Many of us After the assault over the Kubanie and Tierek rivers by Malgabiek and my cop, could have imagined Asia beyond the cloud-topped, snow-covered Caucasus. Well, perhaps we were not so many now, since most were now resting in the earth between Asia and the suburbs of Berlin. Would any of us get through to the end? Who dared to still believe in the genius of the soldier's luck? We were in the company of some who already had been standing under its protection, and had repeatedly, thanks to miracles, been saved from death. However, at some time, the last straw would be drawn for each one of us, and the soldier's death would come. Our spirits had sunk steadily during the last days, and had come dangerously close to zero. Here in the forests of Brandenburg, we now met a new enemy. Roving armed gangs of Polish and Russian civilians began to show up at night to rob and plunder. Frequently they attacked smaller units of our division. They were beginning to escape from their camps, find weapons, and were now trying to correct their personal records for a proper alibi at the prospect of the approaching Red Army. These were individuals who had been transferred from a miserable existence in Belarusian and Ukrainian hovels, filthy, stinking, lice and flea-filled mud huts, and had been hired to work in the German war industry. For the first time in their grey, hopeless lives, they had encountered well-organized workplaces and humane living conditions. Their dirty and flea-infested clothes had been replaced by clean overalls and real underwear from the already scarce supplies of their host country. Though, after unaccustomed hot soapy showers and disinfectants, their lice and fleas swim away into no-no land. Now they called themselves Sklaven Arbeit, slaves. But they had been paid, simply housed in Spartan barracks, and had been fed with their accustomed regional food from collective kitchens and clean mess halls. There had been nightly entertainment for them, theatre performances in their mother tongue, evenings with music both classical and folk, and variety shows. Gradually they had learned to use soap and water on a daily basis, and other elementary concepts of personal hygiene. In short, they had begun to live like human beings. They were now hardly any danger to us, but their behavior gave us a clear hint of what, in those days, was the situation behind the front. This contributed to the depression on our spirits. There could no longer be any doubt that the authorities had begun to lose control over the situation on the home front. These were bad signs. In the middle of this heavy depression, new rumors suddenly began to circulate. They popped up here and there and spread like wildfire from man to man. Soon after the first intimation had come up in the divisional staff, everybody knew. The rumors that woke us up from our mechanical, trance-like defensive fighting and gave us new hope and new spirit said that Reichsführer SS Himmler had contacted the Supreme Commander of the Western Allies, Eisenhower. It was said that he, after having heard Himmler's narration of the Red Danger, had realized the equally great effect on the British and Americans of this danger. It was a danger to the whole West. They now had supposedly agreed about common struggle against Bolshevism before the Red Army reached Berlin. At last! Year after year, the greatest Germanic peoples had been in bitter, bloody feuding with each other. They sacrificed their best youth in wars between brothers, while their common enemy had taken advantage of the situation to force his way deeper into Europe. Now, in the darkest hours of the West, the previous adversaries could have joined in facing the imminent threat. It was too wonderful to be true. But we believed, because what else should we believe in and hope for? There, a few miles from the heart of the German capital, we found new strength, tightened our helmets, and fought with new determination. We no longer had the attitude of the death sentence to sell your life as dearly as possible, but instead we went on cheerfully and hopefully, like those certain of victory. What then did it matter if the agreement, in other respects, would perhaps be humiliating for Germany? That was something relative. The main thing was that all forces came together right then. Closer to the gates of Berlin, the Red Army should not be allowed to come. And they could not do that if the British and Americans joined us. Certainly it would be enough if just our own comrades in the West could be made available and come to our help. We would hit the Bolsheviks outside Berlin, chase them eastward, annihilate the entire Red Army, and smash the Soviet regime to pieces so that it should never be able to rise again. These prodigious thoughts. They had been lying smoldering in the subconscious during the difficult years of constant defeat and had kept the fighting spirit alive. Now they rose up in full strength and lived our enthusiasm again. There was a new spring in our step. Our bearing was more upright, and we made use of our weapons with exultant rage. Once again, we sang during troop movements and hurrahed while storming forth in counterattacks. The men fought with feverish eagerness. All of us were convinced that the Red Army would soon meet a withering.
Sniper still nice.
10. Berlin bleibt deutsch.
Riprendi le armi.
The forces from the east did not take any notice of our reborn fighting spirit.
Non ce la
They
faccio.
just kept on moving forward in the same inexhaustible stream of control. They pressed implacably back, closer and closer to Berlin, and gradually gave way to smaller suburbs with grocery shops, newsstands, post offices, cinemas, and gardens. Violent engagements raged around and through these residential suburbs, but now without mercy. Hardly any reason for us to evade and spare them from enemy devastation and mass murder. That was why we clung tight, as long as possible, in every small village. The Bolsheviks had reached the flank, or even had come behind us.
Non ce la
Then we had to be quick and fight our way out. Several times every day we fought our way out of real death traps in this manner. Every time, some of us were left there, having fallen
Non
into
ce
the
la
trap.
faccio.
The residential suburbs were our base, where we tried to hold out as long as possible in order to give time for the defense further back to get organized. But in
Vigliacco.
between, the struggle went on as violently, if not even faster, out in terrain as varied between dense forests and open fields. The day before we reached the limits of Greater Berlin, on about the 21st of April, my platoon with the half-tracks was sent forward. We had active support with infantry soldiers and the Wehrmacht out in the open, right to Ley Ivan. Our comrades were well dug in, facing the edge of the wood, out of which the hollering brown-yellow masses attacked time after time. Here we suddenly and unexpectedly had to deal with Bolshevik infantry who had no proper artillery or tank support. Under such circumstances, their losses were sure to be heavy, but that did not bother their commanders, who just sent forth their people totally without mercy. As our mortars went into action behind a rise in the terrain, their loss of men increased even more. We let them come out some distance on the field, then the rounds exploded over them with annihilating effect. They did not knock down just one or two men, but 5 or 6 fell in the grass, or tried, bleeding, to drag themselves back after each impact. Then the Russians turned round and fled, as they thought, to protect the edge of the wood. But they were met there by the same rain of steel, now even more effective, because the rounds exploded against the tree trunks, so
La patrulla è perduta!
even more
È
spread.
un inferno!
Out in the field,
Ci
in front of our
massacrano!
position, the number of fallen Russians increased. They were no longer lying, one here and one there, in tight groups. Our own men over there became enthusiastic at the platoon's precision of aim, and were lying hurrahing in their foxholes. Our
Riprendi le
ammunition was
armi.
finished, and a half-track was sent back to the supply unit to get
Riprendi le
on its
armi.
round. As we, smoking, were waiting for new ammunition and bolted at attack, we suddenly heard an
Siamo sotto il
unmistakable
fuoco nemico.
clatter and the dull drone of tanks. Now, our position was finished. The German commander there obviously had the same opinion, because the infantry retreated past us. The 3 men stayed in their positions, volunteers with Panzerfäuste. For us, there was nothing else to do but to drive back.
Muoviti,
We could
soldato.
not resist, though, driving up behind a group of trees, and from there watching the final outcome in the field. Between the sparse trunks, we had a good view. The thunder of engines grew and came ever closer.
Time to fight
There,
back.
at the edge of the forest, the tree tops floated to and fro, as if a violent storm raged or a giant advanced. With creaking and broken trunks, a huge armored giant pressed down the last impeding
Muoviti,
trees and
soldato.
rolled out into the field. Close to it, one on each side, 2 others heaved their way forward. In their tracks, 2 more
Ci
followed.
massacrano.
Firing at the retreating infantry, they drove out into the field. In the foxholes over there, 3 small human beings lay crouching,
Riprendi
with
le
their
armi.
hands clenched hard
Ritorna
around
indietro.
their oyster, with thumping hearts, listening to the ever louder thunder from the tank engines. Man against
Yacco.
machine. Now the whole ground over there was trembling from the enormous weight of the giants. Rigid with excitement, we stared out. There could not be 50 meters between them. They had no nerves, those 3. The tanks maintained very small distances between each other, 10 to 12 meters perhaps, as they rolled forward. They had seen our infantry retreating, and hardly thought that death could be waiting for them in the abandoned positions. Soon they were quite
Abbiamo
close to
perso la
the
pattuglia.
still shooting at the retreating infantry, and taking no notice of the foxholes. A cigarette
Muoviti,
burned
soldato.
unnoticed between my fingers that was shaking with excitement. For God's sake, get up now, before it is too late!
Shinge.
In piedi,
The tanks
soldato.
are driven into a perfect position for the 3
piedi,
comrades in the
soldato.
holes. The small gaps between them
Ci
became
massacrano.
their destruction. When the first tank had come to a distance of 10 meters, 3 heads and Panzerfäuste came up like lightning. 3 short bangs. Fire shot out of the Panzerfäuste. 3 tanks were hit.
Siamo sotto il fuoco
2 of
nemico.
them were burning. One of them exploded almost
Ci
immediately.
massacrano.
Shooting at.
The third rotated round and round on its damaged track. The heads disappeared quickly with the empty tubes and came up again with 3 new
Non ce la
Panzerfäuste.
faccio.
Before it had time to withdraw from the Panzerfäuste's short range of fire, the rotating tank received its death blow, and at the same time,
soldato.
the 2 remaining were penetrated by
Riprendi le armi.
annihilating tank mines. 5 heavy tanks were burning out on the field, destroyed by 3 unknown infantry soldiers who now rushed up from the hole and in a zigzag ran back over the field to get away from the advancing Russian infantry. The bullets whistled around them and scratched up the
piedi,
earth
soldato.
around their feet. But before we rushed off to rejoin the company and avoid being surrounded, we could see our comrades disappear, unhurt, down into the dip
Ci
in the ground.
massacrano.
The sun had been shining from a clear sky all morning.
Fire NATO.
It was the hottest day of
Non
the
ce la
whole spring
faccio.
so far. Summer was coming. In the gardens of the residential suburbs, the fruit trees were blazing in the most wonderful blossom.
Via.
Sprouting little buds had broken their covers and burst into fresh, light green leaves. How nice, just for an hour, to be allowed to forget the war, to forget the noise, to breathe the smells
Non
of
ce la
nature,
faccio.
of fresh foliage and flowers, and to appreciate the coming of new life. But we could not take the peace and quiet for granted. Bloody events pushed us and chased us from position to position. There was hardly time to take a few drags on a cigarette between the fights.
La pattuglia è
In the
perduta.
afternoon, the company was ordered to dismount and go into action on foot. The drivers took the half-tracks back under cover from fighter planes. Under the command
Riprendi le
start,
armi.
we went forward along the road that was to be blocked against the enemy tanks.
Massacrano.
Truce.
2 other companies had the task of taking up frontal positions parallel to the road. To the left of the road, there was a belt of trees. We were given our positions to keep the
Non
flank
ce la
clear.
faccio.
We had 3 machine guns and
Siamo
a
sotto il fuoco
7.5
nemico.
centimeter anti-tank gun, as well as our usual small arms.
Muoviti,
We had a
soldato.
perfect shooting range against the open terrain, which separated us from the next belt of forest. Tunics and shirts were taken off at once, and we started digging among tree roots and stones. Looking back, it is irresistible to
Non
make
ce la
an
faccio.
amused comparison with the exercises in digging positions during the military training back home in Sweden.
Ci
How
massacrano.
idyllic that was.
Fuori di qui!
No exaggerated hurry, no unnecessary sweat.
Ci massacrano.
Calmly and leisurely, and with very little seriousness, the spades were turned. Who thought of the vitally important meaning of the ability
Non ce
to
la
dig
faccio.
in rapidly? That ability, in war, meant as much for your life as handling your weapon the
Riprendi
right
le
way.
armi.
Hundreds
Fuori
of
di
thousands
qui!
of lives
Fanteria
have been
nemica
wasted
individuata.
In piedi, soldato.
just
Riprendi
because
le
of
armi.
laziness and unwillingness to dig like moles.
Muoviti, soldato.
But we, who now began to dig down in the stony ground of this forest belt, had seen enough of the war to know the meaning of the protection.
Riprendi le armi.
Because of that, we worked furiously,
Siamo allo
prized
scoperto.
up stones, cut tree roots, blew up
Muoviti,
earth,
soldato.
with speed. Our backs were bent like drawn bows, sinews and muscles strained. Sweat poured from our foreheads and rained down our naked backs.
Non ce la
You
faccio.
did not jeopardize your life for a smoke. The centimeters into the ground that you would lose cost more than a case of cigarette. The sun was blazing without mercy, and our throats ached from thirst. The Balkans could turn up any moment.
Siamo allo
Sounds
scoperto.
of battle were heard from all directions beyond the
Riprendi le
forest,
armi.
and we
Massacrano.
redoubled our
Non ce la
efforts.
Fanteria nemica individuata.
faccio. Non ce la faccio.
Pounded into temples, and the arm muscles quivered
Massacrano.
from the
Non ce
exertion.
la faccio. Per terra.
Someone took them to hush and pointed at the edge of the forest on the other side. Everyone threw down the
Riprendi
tools,
le armi.
held it on heads, and jumped down into the holes in their weapons. Men came running fast over the field towards us. Our hands clutched the weapons harder, and our eyes were screwed up,
È un inferno!
cruel and calm, at the approaching
Massacrano.
soldiers. They were our Fallschirmjäger. Their carrying helmets that just in time told us their identity, saved them from being cut down by our machine guns. There
Fuori
were
di
about
qui!
70 men who came at top speed
Non
towards
ce la
us.
faccio.
As they came closer, we stepped up in the helmet. They were startled as they saw half-naked troops with submachine guns in their hands. The Spark shouted to them. He called
Non
for
ce
their
la faccio.
commander, a Feldwebel with the Knight's Cross, the Narvik shield,
Andiamo a
and the
fuoco!
Kratos, and let him give an overview of the situation. They had just been thrown out of their positions in
Ce
the
la
forest
faccio.
belt in front of us, but had only just infantry. They had run out of ammunition, and then they had withdrawn.
Soldato.
Their company commander had been killed, as well as the
Fuori
2
di
men
qui!
who tried to bring back his body. Schwab decided that we should make a counter.
Massacrano.
Since he had taken command over the
Muoviti,
Fallschirmjäger,
soldato.
we were a full company of more than 100 men, just
Muoviti,
like in the
soldato.
old
Non
days.
ce la faccio.
The newcomers got ammunition from our supply, and then the entire
massacrano.
force formed out into a firing line.
Ci
I ran in the
massacrano.
middle, beside Schwark. Not a shot came as we crossed the field. In the forest belt, it still remained peaceful, but as we came out in the open field again, it broke loose. Down.
Non ce
Schwark
la
turned
Fanteria nemica
frantically.
individuata.
Shout like hell as we rolled
Ritorna
up.
indietro.
The lads are almost finished, but we'll get them going if we
Ritorna
shout all
indietro.
together.
Via
Forward!
terra.
Schwark
Siamo
shouted,
sotto il fuoco
and I rushed
nemico.
up after him with a wild and husky hurrah! It was hard, because I was as tired and
Riprendi le
weary as
armi.
the others, but it worked, and the cry spread and echoed all over the narrow field as we ran towards the violent infantry fire. As much as it stimulated us, it demoralized the enemy, and in a flash, we were over them. Like frightened rabbits, they jumped out of their holes to get away, but our bursts reached their targets, no matter how they turned and twisted among the trees. We advanced and retook some hundreds of meters as a defense sector for the Fallschirmjäger. We promptly established a new defense of the contested forest belt. Ivan did not wait long before coming back. Schwark, the Feldwebel, and I went around and supervised the preparation. As I got furthest out on the right flank, it flashed into my mind that Schwark had forgotten to connect with the company's vital road. In his eagerness to achieve a clever counterattack, he had not thought of this important detail. Our position was unsupported. By that time, we were with the bell cable away on the other flank, some hundreds of meters distant. It could be a matter of minutes. The last day's fights had brought so many sudden surprises and unexpected changes of situation that you had to be prepared for anything. A thundering clamor came suddenly from the blocking position by the road, where most likely Russian tanks were involved. I did not waste time running over to Schwark to inform him, but sent a man to report that with 3 men I had gone to take up the connection again. We ran over the fields and through the forest for all we were worth. Now the sound of gunfire could clearly be heard from a group of villas that I knew were within the blocking position. From there came the typical, dull, muffled crack of anti-tank guns. My fears grew. They were confirmed as we came out of the edge of the forest and could see the road in front of us. There, the last men of the 2 companies ran for their lives onto the road. Several were lying there already. One of the fleeing, with one trouser leg ripped open and flapping, waved excitedly at us that we should run backwards. It was his last deed in life. The next moment, he disappeared in the explosion of a shell from the Starling tank that with mounted infantry had just appeared from a bend about 100 meters from us. The men at the left rear anti-tank gun managed to shoot away some of the infantry from the tank before they were torn to pieces by a shell from the giant tank. We turned around at once. Now it was really only a matter of seconds. The whole would be lost if the Bolsheviks in front of us and behind us managed to make contact and realize our situation before we had had the time to withdraw from the trap. We had to get further back before they squeezed the pincers around us. Like hunted hares, we leapt away over the fields, through the forest to the company. There, they had just begun to get new combat contact with Ivan again. Short bursts of fire whirled in among the trees at the forest edge on the other side, where the attacking enemy lay. In an instant, I had Schwark informed about the situation. He cursed wildly as we had to abandon the position without getting the chance to give the Bolsheviks a new fight. But there was nothing else to do than order the company out of there immediately. To fool the Bolsheviks, the machine guns first fired continuously towards the edge of the forest, while the rest of our men withdrew. Then the machine guns were pulled out of the trenches and brought into the forest. All the SS men and Fallschirmjäger at full speed ran uphill and down dale. We remained in the narrow forest and ran close to, but parallel with, the road. We dared not get too close to the road. The Bolsheviks had most likely advanced a long way with their tanks. We ran about 2 kilometers with the sweat dripping. All the time, with a hammering heart, I thanked my lucky star that had brought not only myself, but also the entire company out of a terrible situation. Eventually, we turned up beside a road leading into a residential suburb, and there met comrades from our Aufklärungsabteilung. They were the survivors of the 2 companies that, along with us, had tried to hold the blocking position. Sturmbannführer Saalbach was there, giving orders about the preparations for defense of the village. The first time in a long time, we now
eliminato. Siamo sotto il fuoco nemico.
To await the arrival of the Red Army.
Tutti a terra.
One of them was a fat, red-faced grocer, whose acquaintance we made as I, along with Erich Lindenau and Kraus, intended to enter the shop to take in store. We were hungry as hunters, and had not had much other than haversack rations for the previous few days. He showed up at the door. "You won't get anything here without money." We looked at each other in amazement. So far we had only experienced civilians who pressed food on us. Lindenau, who was not what you call small and skinny, stepped forward to the grocer, pushed forward his chin, and fastened his eyes on him. "How dare you, old man? We are risking our lives for you. You should be glad that we are not Bolsheviks. They could cost you your life. Move over, fatso! Lindenau shouted and pushed his submachine gun into the man's belly. The man went from red to quite green in the face and retreated, shaking. We pushed him aside and helped ourselves behind the counter to sausage, butter, and a loaf of bread. As we were standing there eating, we threw one or two contemptuous glances at the trembling owner. Then the door was opened, and the commander himself, Sturmbannführer Saalbach, entered. He saluted with a thundering Heil Hitler and ordered a bottle of beer. We were already so at home in the shop that it was natural for me to pass a bottle to him over the counter before the nonplussed grocer had even moved a finger. "It was nice of you to help my boys to food," the commander said, with a friendly smile on his dusty face, and handed over a bill with the words, "Keep the change." Cringing, bowing, and repulsively smiling, the impudent shopkeeper opened the door for our commander, called him Oberst, and croaked an ingratiating Heil Hitler. We put the remaining bread and sausages in our bags, jumped over the counter, and headed for the door without looking at the man. In the door, Lindenau turned round, picked out a nice white visiting card from his well-worn wallet, and gave it to him. "When the Russians are back over the mountains, you or your heirs can send me the invoice. Goodbye." He put a foot behind the grocer and gave him a push in the stomach so that he fell to the floor with a bump, went out and closed the door with a crash that broke the door window into 1,000 pieces. The other civilians disappeared and looked for safety in shelters as anti-tank guns and our light half-tracks were driven into position. Now the village really had that complete look of the front line. Only the ruins were missing. The houses were undamaged and tidy, but that would soon change. The three of us had orders to advance and observe, so that we could give notice when Ivan was coming. It seemed they had been delayed in some way, otherwise they would have been there already. In a ditch, in the shadow of some slopes, we found a perfect spot. It was a short way from the road out of the village, but still it was bordered by numerous, very nice family houses, away towards the direction of the enemy. We lay chatting about everything, especially about the shabby fellow in the shop, while we chewed his sausages and bread, and kept a sharp eye on the road. It was nice to be lying that way in peace and quiet for a while, and enjoying the warmth of the spring. There was rumbling and crashing in the surroundings, but right there, it was calm and pleasant. Kraus was looking hard at the bend in the road about 400 meters from us. He blinked his eyes and looked again. "What idiot is coming here on a bicycle?" he said. All three of us stared in that direction, speechless with amazement. Someone was actually cycling along all by himself, heedless, with no thought that the road any second would be under artillery or machine gun fire.
Siamo sotto il fuoco
The bicycle
nemico.
wobbled from one side of the road to the other. Either the man was a beginner or he was drunk, most likely the latter, as he seemed to ignore the danger. It was too grotesque. A Sunday cyclist in no man's land. He must be both drunk and crazy. It was an Ivan. When he was only 60 to 70 meters away from us, we could clearly see him.
Inferno.
No wonder he was cycling so badly. It was probably the first time he had sat on a bicycle. In Soviet Russia, only the Stakhanov heroes could afford such luxury. He swayed along on his latest bike in the sun, with his submachine gun on his back and a dispatch case at his side. With pleasure, he enjoyed the sight of the nice houses and the well-kept gardens, not seen at home in Russia.
L'obiettivo è
It
fuori
was a
portata.
shame to destroy the idol, but that dispatch case interested us. It might contain important papers. So, a life was finished to save others. A poor Russian, like most of his fellow countrymen, harmless and kind when not incited to war by despots. With the mild nickname of Batyushka, the father, he was brutally interrupted on his life's first bicycle tour that had taken him the wrong way, in among the feared Germanski.
Siamo sotto il
With
fuoco
bullets
nemico!
and a
Sotto il fuoco
submachine
nemico!
gun, he tumbled over the bike. A figure turned up on the road in a flash, pulled the strap of the dispatch case over his slack, dead arm, and disappeared again. Fresh young blood flowed over the asphalt.
Siamo sotto il fuoco
Kraus
nemico!
ran back with the Russian dispatch case to give it to the company commander, to be forwarded to the divisional staff. Before he had time to return to us, the Bolsheviks launched their attack against the
Il
village.
calibro è
It came from the
insufficiente!
south, on the flank. Now it was safer for the two of us to get back to the company
È un inferno!
before we were cut off. We threw ourselves over the road, down into the ditch on the other side, where we were better protected from the shooting, which now started to spread in our direction too. Then we ran along the ditch, back into the village, where the fighting had already started. We defended ourselves stubbornly, but in the long run we could not hold the position against their tanks and artillery, and, despite heavy losses, more of their advancing stormtroops. Struggling from house to house in highly dangerous steeplechases, through open gardens, and turning around the corners of the houses to riddle the Red Army soldiers with some final bursts, we retreated to the northwest, where the forest once again hid our small unit. The Stalin tanks could drive a bit further westwards, on the highway. Orders came that we must, at all costs, recapture the village and close the road again. 3 King Tigers came as much needed support. If we had not had them, it was likely that the counterattack would not have
Il calibro è
started. We had
insufficiente!
come close to being physically and mentally finished. The expectation of being able to stop the Red Army in front of Berlin, and of having the cooperation of the Western enemies, had faded. In fact, we were already standing just outside Berlin, and could see yellow and blue-red trains of the Metropolitan Railway, standing there and being shot to pieces on demolished embankments.
Siamo
Time
allo
after time,
scoperto!
we saw railway stations with names that are associated with Berlin. Over and over again, we saw signs for Commerzbank, Lokalanzeiger, and Berliner Morgenpost. This was all extremely depressing. From more and more gable
Riprendi le
walls,
armi.
the words Berlin bleibt Deutsch stared down on us. But now we began to ask ourselves with despair in our hearts, will Berlin really remain German? The last hope was now with Obergruppenführer Steiner and his northern army, which, we were told, was on its way to our rescue. In the twilight, we advanced towards the small
Non ce la
residential
faccio.
suburb, now on fire. Before the Bolsheviks had time to organize an efficient resistance, we were over them with newborn, furious, attacking energy, which the presence of the King Tigers had given us. With
Muoviti,
murderous
soldato.
determination, we let the weapons play among the surprised Russians. They had felt
Siamo
secure
allo
for the night,
scoperto.
and therefore had let the vodka flow. They fell in their drunkenness, and more than one enemy embraced his bottle in death. Those who managed to escape out into the darkness were easily picked off. Most were hit by a burst of gunfire or a hand grenade when they showed up briefly as black shadows against the light from a burning house. We had recaptured the suburb. Together with Lindenau, I happened to pass the grocery store.
Siamo allo
Over the iron
scoperto!
fence, a broad, formless body was hanging. It was the grocer. The Bolsheviks had nailed him on the poles and tied his hands. I saved some money there, Lindenau whispered hoarsely.
Abbiamo occupato la
I
zona.
turned away and vomited. Of the remaining civilians, all but one were found dead. The only survivor was a 40-year-old woman fatally wounded by one of our shells.
Obiettivo
She
raggiunto.
had been in the midst of a crowd of red soldiers who had begun to let loose their animal instincts on her. Why on earth had she stayed behind when most civilians had fled? She had had her husband reported as missing in action at Stalingrad, and had figured out that by staying behind, she would, once behind the Red Army lines, sooner get in touch with him if he were still alive as a POW. Now she lay there dying, the best that could happen to her instead of dragging herself through a life ruined
Siamo
by
allo
mass
scoperto!
rape,
Attentiamo.
slowly consumed by Siberian syphilis.
Ci massacrano.
We quickly organized our defense. After a short while, a smaller column of trucks full of unsuspecting Russians came driving from the east. We led the cars through and let them drive far in on the main street. Then, for several minutes, our machine guns and machine pistols rattled against the cars.
Muoviti,
They
soldato.
swerved and skidded, crashed into house walls and fences, and
Non ce
overturned.
la faccio.
We
Siamo allo
kept on
scoperto.
firing until every movement in the chaos ceased, and the last cry of pain died out. With Panzerfäuste, 3 Stalin tanks were knocked out the same way, before the Bolsheviks became aware of the situation. During the night, we had to defend ourselves almost uninterruptedly against their attacks, but now lacking the support from the Tiger tanks, we had to withdraw.
Abbiamo occupato la zona.
During the early hours of the morning, orders came that our task was completed.
È un inferno.
Towards the
Muoviti,
northwest,
soldato.
for the 100th time, we fought our way out of a Russian encirclement. Some comrades remained lying on the ground in the bursts of fire,
Ci
but most of us
massacrano.
escaped. 11. From house to house.
Calibro insufficiente.
Gross Berlin, it said on a big yellow road sign that we passed, as, in continuous fighting, we moved ever further westward that morning. It was a couple of days after the 20th of
inferno!
April, Hitler's birthday. We had left behind the wide belt of burning residential suburbs. Big factory blocks towered in
piedi,
front of us,
soldato.
and beyond them we could discern the sea of residential blocks of the giant city. A blue-grey haze lay like a veil over millions of inhabitants. It smothered everything with the dark smoke of vast conflagrations. The Western allies of Bolshevism were spreading even more destruction with their bomber armadas over the already badly damaged city. They had started the last great offensive, which would now go on non-stop until the day of surrender.
Siamo
We heard
incastrati.
the thunder of bomb explosions in the center of the city. We saw flying fortresses in huge formations making high-level sweeps across
ce
a
la
sky
faccio.
that was speckled with small clouds from bursting anti-aircraft shells. Around the bomber formations, patterns and
Calibro
circles,
insufficiente.
curves
Non
and
ce la
lines
faccio.
were woven by the vapor
È un
trails from the
inferno.
German fighters. The air combats were continuous. To Streen and onwards, we had experienced
Vigliacco.
only the prelude so far. Now, the real Battle of Berlin began. The final struggle against the giants in east and west, the twilight of the gods,
Ritorna
had reached its
indietro.
peak
Abbiamo
and
occupato la
passed
zona.
into its last phase. We found positions already prepared that the civilian population had dug and built
Ci
ever
massacrano.
since the Russian breakthrough on the
Siamo allo
Vistula
scoperto.
at the turn of the year. At important road junctions, the blockades against Russian tanks were standing ready to be dragged into positions with tractors or tanks. There were trams filled with paving
Ritorna
stones
indietro.
and big
Fuori
freight
di
wagons
qui!
with well-known names such as Knauer, Berliner Rollgesellschaft,
Ritorna
Schmeling,
indietro.
and others.
Non ce la
Small
faccio.
foxholes, which had been dug in on almost every
Non ce la
street
faccio.
crossing, were mostly already
Ritorna
manned by some
indietro.
Volkssturm men,
Vigliacco.
armed with a
Inferno.
couple of Panzerfäuste. Everywhere, Volkssturm soldiers could be seen, most of them with just a helmet and a badge as identification. Among them were
Muoviti,
lots of young
soldato.
boys from the Hitlerjugend, aged between 8 and 12 or 13 years. After a mercilessly cruel war of bombs, they were just as hardened as old front-line veterans. In the middle of the worst bombardments,
take it.
they
Ci
showed a
massacrano.
confidence and a balance of
Non ce
mind
la
that
faccio.
scared us. We thought that these boys should be playing harmlessly in the schoolyard. As the enemy became visible or could be located by his firing, the faces of these small boys assumed the same grim, hard, resolute look as those of hardened veterans. Added to the confidence in battling
Riprendi
these
le armi.
warrior children came a rancorous frenzy and a boundless contempt of death which we grown-ups could not muster. With the agility and speed of weasels, they climbed and struggled their way into completely impossible positions to knock out a Russian tank with a Panzerfaust, or to finish off one or several advancing Red Army soldiers with a hand grenade. There were quite a number of Russian tanks put out of action by small boys in their early teens during the Battle of Berlin. We were constantly forced back.
Dit is een kind of medal.
Out in Karlshorst lay the great racecourse, one of the largest in the world.
Wait, no.
During peacetime, it attracted like a magnet tens of thousands of horse racing, enthusiastic Berliners and foreigners several times a week. We held this securely until the 23rd of April. Then a violent battle developed around the circuit and its closest surroundings. On the green lawn in the middle, our mortars were brought into position, together with those of the neighboring companies. The remaining platoons fought as infantry outside. Whistling and howling Russian shells hit the stable buildings and the platforms. Wooden benches and walls were splintered and whirled around in the air, and concrete walls were crushed. The artillery fire grew into a rising crescendo from all sides.
Choose counterattack.
The great final bombardment of Berlin had begun.
Attack before the enemy
An
does.
impenetrable wall of gun barrels closed, slowly but implacably, around the city. In the monotonously thumping thunder of the artillery and air bombs, the rattle of small arms could only be heard at closer range. Amongst it all were the crashes of collapsing buildings. The Bolsheviks had forced a barricade and broken through. Our own people were being chased over the track as we drove away. The Red Army soldiers were on our tail. Once again we were surrounded, and once again we managed to fight our way out. Our next position of resistance became an enormous group of factories, crowned with the initials ASEA in giant letters. It became a fortress that temporarily held back the assault.
Counterattack.
The Russian losses were horrible, because we could fire at them from all possible angles thanks to the location of the factory buildings. Then they put in heavy artillery. It sang and thundered all around, and the blast waves threw us, half-conscious, to and fro between the walls. The defenders who were killed by collapsing walls, ceilings, and iron girders numbered more than those who got a direct hit or were hit by splinters. It became unendurable to stay in this inferno. Whirling stone, scrap iron, and bloody body parts made the air impossible to breathe, filled as it was with limestone dust and gunpowder gases. Once more, we fought our way out with death just an inch behind us. All day, we fought our way back in this way. Surrounded over and over again, we struggled on through narrow passages and back streets.
We got our panzers.
Often we passed right through the middle of the
That's the
fighting
next
line
fight.
of other units. We always got through, but with steadily growing losses. Sometimes we could